The grand hall of the Ainsley Conservatory was a temple to sound, and he was its high priest. The air smelled of polished wood, old paper, and a faint, expensive perfume. Sunlight streamed through high windows, catching the dust motes dancing above rows of students who sat, perfectly still, hanging on his every word. His name was Julian Thorne, and at 32, he had already conquered the world of classical piano. His hands, which he assured for millions, rested lightly on the closed lid of a magnificent Steinway as he dissected a student's performance of a Chopin nocturne. "The emotion is not in the pedal," he said, his voice cool and clear, a scalpel of sound. "It is in the silence between the notes you are afraid to leave empty. You fill the space with noise, not feeling." The student, a young man with sweat beading on his forehead, nodded frantically. Everyone knew a masterclass with Julian Thorne was equal parts privilege and terror. He was famous for two things: his breathtaking technique and his brutal honesty. He believed true art belonged to a select few, and he was the gatekeeper. As he was about to demonstrate the phrase, a sound intruded. It wasn't a wrong note from a student. It was a single, persistent plink. Plink. Plink from the grand piano on stage. A pure, clean A above middle C, struck with metronomic regularity. It was the sound of a piano being tuned. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The student shifted. He tried to ignore it, launching into Chopin's delicate passage. His playing was, as always, immaculate. Every note precisely weighted, every phrase sculpted like marble. But against the backdrop of that steady plink, it felt strangely brittle. Asterisk plink. Plink, plink, asterisk. He stopped. The beautiful phrase died in the air. A heavy silence fell, broken only by that infuriatingly calm note. He slowly turned his head toward the source of the sound. At the piano sat a woman. She looked to be in her late 40s, maybe early 50s. Her hair, a mix of brown and gray, was pulled back in a simple, no-nonsense bun. She wore a faded blue dress with tiny white flowers, the kind you might find in a garden shop or a thrift store. Her frame was slight, almost swallowed by the majesty of the instrument. In her hands were not the graceful, poised tools of a pianist, but the practical, worn tools of a tuner, a mute, a tuning lever. Her fingers, he noted with distant disdain, were sturdy with short, practical nails and calluses in places a pianist's hands would never have them. She was entirely focused on the string she was adjusting. Her ear cocked toward the piano's pins, her world narrowed to that one perfect pitch. She seemed utterly unaware of the 25 pairs of eyes now fixed on her, or the icy aura of annoyance radiating from the star at the front of the stage. Julian let the silence stretch, a classic technique to heighten the discomfort. Finally, he spoke, not to her, but to the room, a thin smile on his lips. "It appears we have an accompaniment. A minimalist composition for one repeated note. Avant-garde, I suppose?" A few nervous titters escaped from the students. The woman heard him this time. She looked up, her eyes a calm, mild green. There was no fear in them, only a placid acknowledgment. She gave a small, apologetic nod and went back to her work, but the plink continued. She was in the middle of a process and couldn't simply stop. This was the final straw. Julian Thorne was not accustomed to being ignored, especially not by someone he considered a stagehand, a human tool for the maintenance of his instruments. He stood up, his movements smooth and deliberate, and walked towards the stage. His Italian leather shoes made no sound on the thick carpet. He stopped a few feet from the piano, looking down at her. "I'm trying to teach," he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the hall. "There is an art being discussed here, a delicate art. Do you understand how your sonic needlework interrupts the flow of that?" The woman set her tuning lever down gently on the felt. She looked at him fully now. Her face was kind, lined with the gentle marks of time and weather, not the sharp lines of stress or ambition. The A was flat, she said simply, her voice softer than his, but steady. The whole middle register feels closed in because of it. It'll only take another minute to seat it properly. Julian blinked. He hadn't noticed the piano was flat. He never noticed things like that. Someone always ensured his instruments were perfect before he laid a finger on them. Her explanation, so practical and rooted in the physical reality of the instrument, felt like a dismissal of his artistic complaint. Another minute of that noise is a minute stolen from them, he said, gesturing grandly toward the students without looking away from her. Perhaps, madam, you could confine your limited talents to the maintenance of the instrument, and leave its art to the artists? He infused the word artists with all the weight of his own importance. A deeper silence followed. The students held their breath. This was Julian Thorne in his purest form, separating the world into those who created and those who served. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't look angry or shamed. She just studied him for a moment, as if he were an interesting, slightly out-of-tune mechanism himself. Then something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, but something older, something like quiet pity. It was there and gone in an instant. She offered him that same small, unreadable smile she had given when she first looked up. It wasn't a smile of agreement. It was the smile of someone who knew a secret. Of course, she murmured, almost to herself. She carefully gathered her tools into a worn leather pouch. The art is all that matters. She stood up, her movements efficient and quiet. She was shorter than he'd realized. She gave one last, listening look at the piano, then walked off the stage, her sensible shoes whispering against the wood. She didn't look at the students, didn't look at Julian. She just disappeared through the side door, leaving the hall feeling suddenly empty, the air still vibrating with the ghost of that single. Perfect A, and the weight of his words. Julian turned back to his students, a triumphant little smirk playing on his lips. He had asserted the natural order. He had protected the sanctuary of art from the intrusion of the mundane. Now, he said, clapping his hands once, the sound sharp in the quiet. Where were we? Ah, yes. The silence between the notes. But as he resumed his master class, something felt different. His own playing, when he demonstrated, seemed almost too loud in the now absolute quiet. The absence of that gentle plink was somehow more distracting than its presence had been. For a fleeting second, he wondered if the A really had been flat. He shook the thought away. It was beneath him. She was beneath him. A simple woman with simple tools, already fading from his memory like the last echo of a struck note. He didn't catch her name. He never asked. To him, she was just the tuner. The incident was a minor, forgettable ripple in the serene pond of his greatness. He had no idea he had just looked directly at a sleeping giant and mistaken her for a stone. The grand hall of the Ainsley Conservatory had been transformed. The serious, scholarly air was gone, replaced by the soft murmur of money and the clink of fine crystal. It was the annual autumn gala, the conservatory's most important fundraiser. The stage was draped in rich velvet, and the same Steinway from the master class now gleamed under a spotlight, a silent centerpiece. Julian Thorne moved through the crowd like a sleek, satisfied cat. He wore a tailored tuxedo that cost more than some of the instruments in the practice rooms. He accepted compliments with a practiced, modest nod, his eyes scanning the room to see who was watching. He had just performed. The piece was a technically monstrous etude by a modern composer, all jagged rhythms and furious, crashing chords. He had executed it perfectly. The applause had been loud, respectful, and to his ear, a little bit awed. It was the kind of applause he lived for. Now, he held a delicate flute of champagne, holding court with a small group of wealthy patrons and a few star-struck advanced students. He was explaining his interpretation. "The piece isn't about chaos, you see," he said, swirling the golden liquid. "It's about controlled chaos. The intellect imposing order on the storm. Anyone can play loudly and fast. The art is in making every single note in the middle of that hurricane sound like a conscious choice." A silver-haired man in an impeccably cut suit, a tech mogul and the evening's biggest donor, nodded thoughtfully. "Fascinating. It's like code. The most elegant solution looks simple, but the architecture beneath is immense." "Precisely," Julian said, smiling. He loved being compared to things that were expensive and complex. It was during this comfortable back and forth that he noticed her again. The tuner. She was moving at the edge of the room, almost a shadow. She wasn't in her floral dress tonight. Instead, she wore a simple, slightly outdated black dress, the kind kept for solemn occasions. She carried a silver tray laden with empty champagne flutes and discarded napkins. She was working as part of the serving staff. A faint, cold amusement stirred in Julian. Of course, it made sense. The tuner by day, the server by night. A life lived in the margins of the beautiful world he commanded. She was a fixture, part of the background machinery that made evenings like this possible. He watched her for a moment as she moved with quiet efficiency, her eyes on her task, invisible to the glittering crowd. The tech mogul followed his gaze. "You know, Julian," he said, a playful, slightly champagne-fueled glint in his eye. "Your performance was stunning. But I have to ask, is there any room for, heart in that control? Or is it all architecture?" Julian's smile tightened a fraction. He disliked this line of questioning. It suggested something was missing. "Sentiment is for the audience to project," he replied smoothly. "The performer provides the structure. A perfect vessel. If you pour cheap wine into a crystal glass, it still looks cheap." A gentle voice spoke from just behind his shoulder. "But what if the glass has never held anything at all?" Julian turned. It was her, the tuner. She had approached silently to collect an empty glass from a nearby table. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the piano on stage. Her question hung in the air, simple and devastating. A beat of silence passed. The small group looked from Julian to the woman and back again. The tech mogul's eyebrows rose. Intrigued. Heat crept up Julian's neck. This was twice now. Twice this quiet, insignificant woman had inserted herself into his space, first with her noise, now with her philosophy, and in front of important people. "Excuse me?" Julian said, his voice colder than the champagne. She finally looked at him. There was no challenge in her eyes, only a kind of weary curiosity. "You speak of the vessel," she said, her voice still that soft, clear note. "But music isn't a liquid to be poured. It's already in the wood, in the string. The artist just coaxes it out. Or doesn't." She picked up the empty glass and turned to go. Laughter bubbled up from one of the students, quickly stifled. Julian felt his control of the room slipping. This couldn't stand. He had to reassert himself, to put this in its proper place, to turn it into a lesson for his patrons. "Wait," he said. The word cutting through the murmur. She stopped. "I see," Julian said, turning to address his little audience. A performer again. "We have a critic, and from the most practical perspective." He gave a light, humorless chuckle. "You listen to the insides of pianos all day? You must hear a great deal. Tell us, since you have such a clear idea of what true music is, what we poor performers are missing." He was setting a trap, and he knew it. He expected her to mumble an apology, to shrink back into her role. That would be the end of it. The woman set her tray down on a nearby table with a quiet clink. She faced him fully now. The room's attention, which had been drifting, snapped back to this unexpected scene. "I'm not a critic," she said. "I'm a listener, and I hear a lot of playing. Not much music." A soft, collective gasp rippled through the immediate group. Julian's face flushed. This had gone from an irritation to a direct insult. The tech mogul, sensing drama, leaned in. "Well, this is more interesting than the silent auction. Come on, don't leave us in suspense. If you hear so much, let's hear you." Julian saw his opportunity. He could crush this absurdity with elegance. He could demonstrate his superiority, not just in words, but in the very art she dared to comment on. "A public masterclass is one thing," Julian said, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "But a private opinion, voiced so boldly at a gathering like this, it demands a certain courage, doesn't it?" He gestured toward the stage, toward the silent, gleaming Steinway. "You seem to have a theory. Why don't you grace us with a demonstration? Let's make it interesting. A little duel," he savored the word. "I'll even let you choose the piece. Something simple, of course. Something within your range." He expected stammering, panic, a retreat that would be more humiliating for her than any playing could be. The woman didn't look at the piano. She looked at Julian, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something in her calm eyes. It wasn't fear. It was something like resignation, mixed with a deep, old sadness. It was as if he was a child demanding something he couldn't possibly understand. The crowd was watching, waiting. The moment stretched. Finally, she spoke, her voice so quiet everyone had to lean in to hear. "Very well," she said. A ripple of excitement went through the patrons. This was becoming a spectacle. "Choose, then," Julian said, waving a hand. "A little Mozart? A beginner's minuet?" She took a slow breath, her gaze moving past him, settling on the piano as if seeing an old friend or a forgotten battlefield. When she spoke, the two words dropped into the hushed room like stones into a still pond. "La Campanella." For a second, there was absolute silence. Then a burst of disbelieving chatter. "La Campanella, the little bell. Liszt's infernally difficult showpiece, based on a Paganini violin caprice. It was a piece of fireworks and devilish technique, with enormous jumps, glittering trills, and relentless, bell-like right-hand notes. It was a piece Julian himself used as a final crushing encore to prove his supremacy. It was considered nearly unplayable. Julian stared at her. Then he threw his head back and laughed, a real, sharp burst of sound. "A Paganini Liszt? You cannot be serious." "I am," she said simply. "You'll butcher it," he said, his amusement turning to a sneer. "You'll make a mockery of the instrument itself." "That," she said, meeting his eyes with a sudden, unsettling directness, "is a risk I am willing to take." "Unless you are afraid of the comparison?" The challenge, thrown back in his face, left him no retreat. The trap, he realized with a jolt, might not have been solely his own. "By all means," he said, his voice tight. He gestured grandly toward the stage, a cruel smile fixed on his face. "The stage is yours. Let's hear the music in the wood." He strode to the front row and sat down, crossing his legs, preparing to enjoy the most satisfying humiliation of the evening. The woman, the tuner, the server walked slowly toward the piano. The crowd whispered and nudged each other, phones subtly raised. No one looked at Julian anymore. Every eye in the room was fixed on the slight figure in the plain black dress as she approached the great, gleaming beast of a piano. A strange quiet settled over the grand hall. The polite murmur of the fundraiser was gone, replaced by the thick silence of a crowd holding its breath. All eyes were on the woman in the simple black dress as she walked toward the stage. Her sensible shoes made no sound on the polished steps. She moved not like a performer entering a spotlight, but like someone going to a familiar, private place of work. Julian Thorne sat in the front row, a smirk frozen on his face. He leaned back, one arm draped over the empty seat beside him. This was going to be a beautiful disaster. He knew the piece inside out. He knew every impossible leap, every finger-twisting trill. He had spent months of his youth conquering it, grinding the difficulty into submission, until it was just another weapon in his arsenal. For this woman, this tuner, to even attempt it was laughable. He imagined clumsy hands stumbling over the first run of notes, the piece collapsing into noise within 30 seconds. He would then, graciously of course, take the stage and show her how it was really done. The contrast would be legendary. It would be a story told for years. She reached the piano. She didn't bow to the audience. She didn't adjust the stool with a performer's flourish. Instead, she ran her fingers lightly, almost absently, along the edge of the closed lid, as if greeting an old friend. Then she sat. She spent a long moment just looking at the keys, her hands resting in her lap. She closed her eyes and took a slow, deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling. To Julian, it looked like someone trying to remember a shopping list, or perhaps praying for strength. Then she opened her eyes, placed her hands on the keys, and began. The first notes of La Campanella are like the first drops of a coming storm, single, high bell-like tones spaced apart. When Julian played them, he attacked them with brilliant, sharp precision. Like diamonds striking glass. She did not. Her first note was not a strike, but a release. It blossomed into the air, pure and round, hanging there with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the listener's chest. The next note followed, not as an echo, but as a conversation. Each one was perfectly weighted, a world of difference in the tiny space between loud and soft. They weren't just notes. They were bells, each with its own character, its own tiny song. Julian's smirk faded. This wasn't the clumsy hacking he expected. This was control. A deep, foundational control he hadn't anticipated. Then the tempo began to increase. The right hand started its relentless, chattering pattern, the little bells that gave the piece its name. Here, Julian always showcased speed, a dazzling display of digital dexterity that left audiences breathless. Her speed was there, yes. It was flawless. But it wasn't the point. What she brought out was the laughter in it. The bells weren't just ringing. They were dancing, chasing each other, gossiping. The left hand entered, not as a mere accompaniment of rumbling chords, but as a dark, witty counterpoint. She made the piano sound like two instruments in joyful, complex argument. Julian felt a cold knot begin to form in his stomach. He uncrossed his legs and sat up straighter. The piece built, moving into sections of huge, daring leaps where the right hand must jump from the very high notes to the middle of the keyboard, and back again in the blink of an eye. This was where technique alone was laid bare. This was where she would fail. She didn't. Her hand moved not with the frantic, athletic scramble he sometimes felt in his own performances, but with a flowing, almost lazy grace. It was as if her hand knew exactly where the keys were in space, without having to look, without having to hunt. The leaps were not just accurate. They were musical. The note she landed on was always singing, never just hit. And then came the trills, rapid alternations between two notes that can so easily sound like a nervous buzzing. Julian drilled his until they were a uniform metallic buzz, a testament to endurance. Hers sang. They shimmered. They were less like a mechanical vibration and more like a bird trembling on a branch, full of life and tension and anticipation. They were, he realized with a dawning, horrifying awe, beautiful. The audience was no longer just watching. They were transfixed. The earlier sense of watching a potential train wreck had evaporated. People were leaning forward, mouths slightly open, eyes wide. The tech mogul had forgotten his champagne. The students looked as if they were witnessing a magic trick that rewrote the laws of physics. Julian saw none of them. He only saw her. The woman was gone. In her place was a conduit. Her face was calm, but alive with a profound focus. She wasn't fighting the piano. She was listening to it, her head tilted slightly, her body moving with the phrases not for show, but because she was physically part of the sound being created. She was the tuner, listening to the soul of the instrument she knew so intimately, and asking it to sing its most difficult song. The music swelled into its final, furious cascades. This was where Julian usually poured on the power, hammering the keys in a triumphant, muscular finale that demanded applause. She did something else. She kept the clarity. Every note in the blindingly fast runs distinct as a pebble in a clear stream. But she also drew out a wild, desperate joy from it. It wasn't a conqueror's victory. It was a creature's ecstatic flight. The final chords rang out, not as a brutal slam, but as a deep, resonant declaration that echoed in the bones of the piano and the wood of the hall. Then, silence. Absolute, profound silence. It lasted for 5 full seconds. The woman lifted her hands from the keys and let them rest back in her lap, her head bowing slightly, as if waking from a deep dream. Then the room erupted. It wasn't the polite, programmed applause from Julian's performance. This was a physical wave of sound shouts, whistles, a thunder of clapping that seemed to shake the crystal in the chandeliers. People were on their feet, not just the patrons, but the serving staff at the back, their trays forgotten. The students were applauding so hard, their hands must have hurt, their faces alight with shock and pure, unadulterated inspiration. Julian did not stand. He could not move. He sat in the front row, a statue in a tailored tuxedo, while the world roared around him. The sound of the applause was distant, muffled, as if he were underwater. All he could hear was the ghost of the music she had just made. It replayed in his mind, not as notes, but as a feeling of wholeness, of truth that his own perfect, icy performances had never once touched. He saw her stand. She gave the same small, humble nod she had given him in the masterclass. Not a bow, just an acknowledgement. She wasn't smiling in triumph. She looked almost sad and very, very tired. She turned and walked off the stage, not toward the crowd, but toward the same side door she had disappeared through days before. As she passed his row, her eyes met his for a fleeting second. There was no gloating there. No, I told you so. There was just that same quiet pity he had seen before, now mixed with something like regret. Then she was gone, swallowed by the backstage darkness. The applause was still raging, now mixed with excited chatter. People were buzzing, turning to each other, asking, who was that? The tech mogul was clapping Julian on the shoulder, saying something like, incredible. You set that up, didn't you? What a show. Julian didn't hear him. The cold knot in his stomach had turned into a yawning chasm. He had not just been beaten. He had been unmasked. He had challenged a simple woman to a duel, and in doing so, he had handed her the sword and bared his own throat. The perfect, glittering world he had built, where he was the untouchable king, now felt like a house of cards. And the breath that had blown it down was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. The roar of the crowd was a physical thing, a wall of sound that pushed against Julian as he sat frozen in his seat. It wasn't for him. That was the simple, brutal fact that cut through the noise. Every cheer, every thunderous clap, was for the quiet woman who had already vanished. He felt like a man who had thrown a pebble at a mountain, only to watch the entire mountain rise up and walk away. leaving him exposed on a featureless plain. People were swarming. The tech mogul was talking excitedly, his words a blur of stunning and marketing genius. A conservatory board member, her face flushed, was asking, "Julian, who is she? Is she a new professor? A visiting artist you discovered?" Their questions weren't accusations, but they felt like them. They assumed he was part of this secret, that he had orchestrated this magnificent surprise. The assumption was a kindness that burned worse than scorn. He mumbled something vague, an intriguing talent, and extricated himself, moving through the crowd like a ghost. The party had reignited with a wild, electric energy, all centered on the performance he had meant to be a punchline. He needed air, quiet, and most of all, answers. He didn't go to the lavish after-party in the lobby. He turned down a narrow, utilitarian hallway, away from the marble and velvet, into the backstage of the conservatory. The air grew cooler, smelling of floor polish and dust. The sounds of celebration faded, replaced by the hum of a water heater and the distant, lonely practice of a clarinet from some remote room. He found the door marked Piano Maintenance and Storage. A sliver of yellow light spilled from under it. He hesitated, his hand hovering near the knob. For a fleeting second, he was 7 years old again, outside his stern teacher's studio, afraid of the judgment inside. He pushed the door open. The room was a world away from the grand hall. It was cramped and practical. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with spare parts, coils of wire, felt strips, and cans of polish. A single bare bulb hung over a cluttered workbench where an old upright piano sat with its insides exposed. A complex skeleton of wood and iron. And there, at the bench, was the woman. She had changed out of the black dress and was back in her simple, everyday clothes, a soft sweater and warm trousers. She was carefully wiping down her tuning lever with a clean cloth, her movements slow and methodical. She didn't look up as he entered. The silence in the room was heavy. Julian didn't know how to start. The grand speeches, the clever quips, all the tools he usually used, had deserted him. He just stood there, a man in an absurdly expensive tuxedo, in a room of wood shavings and tools. Finally, she spoke, still not looking at him. "The sostenuto pedal on the Steinway is sticking a little. The middle rod needs adjustment. I'll see to it tomorrow." He blinked. After what had just happened, she was talking about a sticky pedal. "Who are you?" The question came out, blunt and bare. She set the tool down and turned to look at him. In the harsh light of the single bulb, she looked older, the lines on her face more deeply etched. But her eyes were the same, calm, clear, and tired. "It doesn't matter who I am," she said softly. "It matters to me," he said, his voice rising more than he intended. He took a step forward. "That? What you did out there? That wasn't." He struggled for the right word. "That wasn't hidden. That was." He couldn't bring himself to say, "better than me." A man appeared in the doorway behind Julian, out of breath. It was the conservatory director, a small, anxious man who was always worried about donations and reputations. His eyes were wide. "Julian, there you are." And he looked past Julian at the woman, his expression one of awe and confusion. "My dear, that was—" "I have no words. The board is buzzing. Donors are asking. We must talk. A guest residency, a masterclass series." He bustled into the room. The woman shook her head, a firm, final gesture. "No, but the exposure." "Your career," the director spluttered. "I have no career," she said, her voice still quiet, but leaving no room for argument. She looked past the director, her gaze drifting to the exposed strings of the upright piano. "That life is over." "Then what was that?" Julian burst out, frustration breaking through his shock. If you have no career, why? Why play like that? Why hide here? She was silent for a long time. The only sound was the distant clarinet, practicing a mournful scale. When she spoke, it was as if she were speaking to the piano bones on the workbench. A long time ago, she began, her voice far away, I played for people. Big halls. Important people. They called me a prodigy, a vision. It was all very loud. She picked up a small felt hammer from the bench, turning it over in her hands. The music became about the next concert, the next review, the next conquest. The piano stopped being a friend. It became a machine to prove a point. Julian felt each word like a small, sharp tap on his own heart. Then, she said, and her voice caught, just for a second. A deep, old pain surfaced in her eyes, and then was carefully tucked away. Then there was a loss. My family. Everything that really mattered. The noise of that world. It became unbearable. It was all just empty sound. She looked up at Julian, and her gaze was direct. So I left. I found that the only way to hear the music again, the real music, was to listen to it from the inside. To understand why a string sings, or why it doesn't. To feel the hammers and shape the voice of the instrument, not just command it. She gestured around the small, shabby room. This is my concert hall. The silence before the tuning is my audience. The perfect, pure note is my applause. The director was staring, his mouth agape. But your name? Surely we would know. She told them. A name, 2 words. A surname from Eastern Europe. A first name that had once been spoken with reverence in the very circles Julian now aspired to. Julian knew it. Of course, he knew it. It was a legend from a generation before his time. A name mentioned in hushed tones by his oldest teachers. She disappeared, they would say. Vanished at her peak. A terrible tragedy. What a loss to the world. He had imagined a recluse in a castle somewhere, not a woman in a faded sweater wiping down tools in a storage room. The legend was true. But the story was all wrong. She hadn't been lost. She had been found. She had found the music again by stripping everything else away. I played tonight, she said, looking straight at Julian now. Because you asked for a demonstration of the music in the wood. You challenged the silence. So I showed you, once, for that reason only. Not for them. She nodded toward the door, toward the distant party. And not for a comeback. The director looked like he might faint, torn between the thrill of housing a legend and the horror of her refusal to be used. But the world should hear you. The world heard me before, she said, standing up. It changed nothing. This, she patted the side of the upright piano. A gentle, familiar touch. This changes the music for the next person who sits down. That is enough for me. She picked up her leather tool roll, the gesture final. She walked past the stunned director and paused in front of Julian. He was still reeling, the foundation of his entire self cracking. She spoke, her voice so low, only he could hear. You have all the technique in the world, Julian Thorne. You have conquered the notes. But you are still fighting the piano. You must learn to listen to it. It has more to teach you than any audience ever will. And with that, she was gone, slipping out into the hallway, leaving the 2 men standing in the silent, cluttered room, surrounded by the skeletons of instruments and the echoing truth of her words. The ghost of the glittering impossible a campanella seemed to hang in the air, but it was no longer a mystery. It was a testament and a judgment. Julian's duel was over. He had lost more than his pride. He had lost the very idea of what it meant to be a musician. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Julian Thorne's life. The video of the duel did indeed find its way online. It spread not as a scandal, but as a kind of modern fable. The algorithm loved the contrast. The arrogant maestro in his tuxedo, the humble worker in her plain dress, a moment of stunned silence that gave way to roaring applause. Headlines called it The Revenge of the Tuner, and the night the maestro was unmade. For Julian, the outside noise was a distant storm. The real tempest was happening inside his own head. He canceled his next 2 performances, citing a sudden, severe ear infection. It wasn't a complete lie. He felt like he couldn't hear properly anymore. Every time he sat at a piano, the ghost of her La Campanella echoed in the space, making his own familiar pieces sound hollow, like beautifully painted shells with nothing inside. He avoided the conservatory for days, holed up in his sleek, minimalist apartment where a concert grand dominated the living room like a monument to himself. He would stare at it, this machine he had mastered, and feel nothing but a cold distance. He had built his entire identity on being the best, on the flawless execution. Now he had seen a glimpse of something beyond execution, and it had ruined everything. Finally, driven by a restlessness he didn't understand, he went back. It was late evening, the grand halls dark and empty. He walked the same corridors he used to own, but now he felt like a visitor. His feet, almost of their own accord, took him to the piano maintenance room. The door was ajar, a warm yellow light spilling out. He stood in the doorway. She was there, at her workbench. She had a small, delicate action model, a replica of a piano's intricate hammer, mechanism, and was adjusting a tiny spring with a pair of needle-nose pliers. A single desk lamp illuminated her work, leaving the rest of the room in soft shadow. She didn't look up. "It's you," she said, not as a greeting, just a statement of fact. "I don't know what to play," Julian said. The words sounded absurd, childlike, coming from him. But they were the truest thing he'd said in years. She finished her adjustment, tested the spring with her finger, and set the tool down. "Then don't play," she said. "Listen." "To what?" She gestured for him to come closer. She pointed to the strings of the upright piano with its guts exposed. "Hit an A for me, the one above middle C." Frowning, he reached over and pressed the key. The hammer struck, the note sounded. "Again," she said. "But this time, don't let the key come all the way up. Keep the damper off the string. Then hit it again." He did. The note bloomed differently, richer, with a faint, ethereal ring lingering around it. "You hear that?" she asked. "That second sound, the harmonic? That's the piano talking back. You're in a conversation, not giving a speech. You just have to learn its language." It was a tiny thing, a physics lesson. But for Julian, it was a crack of light in a dark room. He had never thought about the damper pedal as a way to listen. He'd only used it as a tool to create blurry, beautiful effects. He started coming back. Not for lessons, not in any formal way. He would appear in the doorway of her workshop, and she would tolerate his presence. He would ask clumsy questions. "Why does this bass note sound muddy on the Bissendorfer in Hall 2? Or, how do you make the treble sing on that old Pleyel without it sounding brittle?" She never gave him artistic advice. She gave him practical answers. She talked about the density of the felt on the hammers, the stiffness of the spring tension, the way humidity swelled the wood and deadened the sound. She spoke of the piano not as a holy object, but as a living, breathing, flawed thing. A partner. One afternoon, he was practicing a difficult passage from a Beethoven sonata, a part that always felt awkward under his hands. He was forcing it, his shoulders tense. "Stop," her voice came from the doorway where she stood listening. "You're fighting it. The hammers on this piano are a bit heavy. You don't need more force. You need a slightly different touch. Try thinking of pushing the key into the bed, not striking it from the air." He tried it. The passage didn't suddenly become perfect, but the grinding tension in his wrist eased. The notes connected more smoothly. It wasn't magic. It was mechanics. But it felt like a revelation. He began to change. He started arriving at the conservatory early, not to claim the best practice room, but to sit in the empty hall while she tuned the concert Steinway. He listened to the process, the slow, patient journey from discord to perfect unison. He heard the care in it. He stopped talking so much in his own master classes. He started asking his students different questions. Not just, why did you phrase it that way? But what do you hear when you play that chord? Does the piano give you the color you want? The students were confused at first, then intrigued. The world outside still saw a fallen star. His agent called with worried offers for comeback tours. Critics, who had once praised his cool precision, now wondered if he'd lost his edge. The story was too delicious. The elitist pianist brought low. They waited for him to shrivel up in shame. He didn't. Slowly, quietly, he began to practice again. But it was a different kind of practice. He spent hours on single lines of music, not to drill speed, but to explore 100 different ways of touching a single note. He played simple scales, listening for the evenness of tone from pinky to thumb. He rediscovered the physical joy of making a beautiful sound, just one, for its own sake. 6 months after the gala, he gave his first public performance. It was a smaller, more intimate hall than he was used to. The program was simpler too, a selection of Schubert Lieder transcriptions, pieces more about song than spectacle. He walked on stage to polite, curious applause. He saw faces in the audience wondering which Julian Thorne they would get tonight, the icy perfectionist or the broken man. He sat at the piano, a different Steinway from the fateful one. He took a moment. He wasn't praying or psyching himself up. He was listening to the quiet of the hall, feeling the give of the keys under his fingers. He thought of the weight of the hammers, the length of the strings, the person who had prepared this instrument for him. Then he began Dot. It wasn't the performance of a god. It was the performance of a man. The technique was still there, flawless as ever, but it was no longer the point. He used it to serve the song. The melodies sang with a warmth that surprised even him. The quiet passages were truly quiet, holding the audience in a shared breath. The loud parts weren't assaults, but passionate declarations. He wasn't conquering the music. He was letting it live through him and the instrument. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was different from the stunned silence after her performance. This was a deep, satisfied, moved quiet. Then the applause came, warm and genuine. Backstage, among the flowers and well-wishers, he saw her. She was standing in the shadows by the stage door, her tool roll in hand. She had come to check the piano after the performance, as she always did. Their eyes met across the crowded room. He didn't go over to her. He didn't need to. He simply gave a small, slow nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't a bow of triumph, but of thanks. A faint, almost invisible smile touched her lips. She gave her own slight nod in return. Then she turned and slipped out the door, back to her world of felt and wire and pure, vibrating sound. Julian turned back to the people congratulating him. He accepted their praise, but it felt different now. It didn't fill a hole. It was just a pleasant sound in the air. The duel was long over. There was no winner and loser anymore. The woman had found her peace in the silence between the notes. And Julian Thorne, for the first time in his life, was finally learning how to listen. He had set out to break a simple woman, and instead she had tuned him. And in the strange, resonant quiet that followed, he had begun to hear the music at last.